bill which not only celebrates perhaps one of the most glorious periods of Indian history, but also represents in some ways what previous speakers have said, a beacon of hope and what India can really offer to the world. I'm particularly privileged, sir, also for two reasons. First, having been belonging to Bihar and having studied in Patna, remember the numerous occasions when Rajgir, one of the favorite picnic spots roaming around the hills of Rajgir, built from the quartz rock, much older than the formations of the Himalayas, and being overawed by the names of Jarasandh, Bimbisar, and Ajat Shatru, the son of Bimbisar, who established Patliputra in the 5th century BC, one could not but see the ruins of glorious Nalanda, quite proximate to the sites of the hills of Rajgir. And I had wondered at that time whether ever a day would come when we would be able to recreate in some form or the other, and innovatively so, another university in its proximate surroundings to represent the ruins of Nalanda. That day, sir, fortunately has arrived. That day is today. That day, sir, is embedded in this legislation which is before us. Second, sir, having been privileged to be a member of the mentor group and a member of the transitional governing body of the proposed Nalanda University, I have been privileged to be associated with the design, with the conception, and with the architecture, and with the sort of vision which has been expressed by many of the previous speakers so eloquently, sir. One does not have to be a linguist or a historian to know that Nalanda, which really means lotus, representing knowledge, and to give knowledge in perpetuity, the seat of ancient learning, established at the time of Kumaragupta in 427 AD, and continued to be there till its destruction at the time of the fall of the Palas in West Bengal around the 12th century. For those 700-800 years, with 10,000 students, residential students, 2,000 teachers, and practicing Buddhism, not in the narrow confines of Buddhism, not in its religious context, but in the broader context of the pursuit of astronomy, of physics, of medicine, and of mathematics. That is the broader context in which a Buddhist university, established at the time of the Gupta Empire, really managed to be the seat of intellectual power. This effort, sir, therefore, I view today, this initiative has four important attributes. First of all, it is a high point of a catalytic effort and can become the icon of Asian Renaissance. Many have increasingly described the 21st century to be the Asian century. I cannot forget what Professor Amartya Sen continued to remind the mentor group, that almost during the period, if not the very week, when Oxford was being inaugurated, Nalanda was being destroyed. And while Oxford does not represent perhaps Europe's oldest university, the older versions being Padua and Bologna and Paris, which for 150 years coexisted with Nalanda, the fact remains that the inauguration of Oxford and the destruction of Nalanda, more or less during a synchronized period, did represent the transition of intellectual power and knowledge from Asia to Europe. And whether the revival and the Asian Renaissance represents not merely the economic wherewithals with which we want to rebuild Asia, improve our life quality, but in some way regain the intellectual and knowledge leadership which Asia had forgone 800 years ago. And therefore this effort of Nalanda is being described by many scholars as the icon of Asian Renaissance. Second, sir, we all know that the old Nalanda University was the confluence of East Asia and South Asia. It represented, therefore, the cross-civilizational influences between these two important strands. And in some ways, therefore, we would want to see whether Nalanda would try to see these commonalities which existed at the time of the old Nalanda as a confluence between East Asia and South Asia. Third, sir, whether it could be a trendsetter for the power of soft diplomacy, and whether in some ways the old Nalanda University could look towards not only a Pan-Asia, but looking to Asia and the Pacific. There are two important attributes to this. First of all, sir, we know that in the Chinese literature, Tanxia, which represents all under heaven, is a formal tribute system, as indeed under the Indians who describe the world through mandala and viewing it in different stages, transcending space, and whether therefore the differences in territory, factors of sovereignty, could in some ways be transcended by the power which in some ways this kind of an effort which existed in Nalanda long time ago could hope to recreate, and could make advances in overcoming geopolitical differences, differences in territory, by the power of what culture and education can wield together. And finally, in terms of its broader purpose, whether institutional mechanisms like the East Asia Summit and other kinds of efforts which are being made can in some ways bring together and strike at the broader commonalities of Asia, Asian values, and what can strike between beyond Asia into the Asia-Pacific region as a whole. I would not like to, sir, go into the main features of the bill. They have been described exceedingly well by some of the previous speakers, but to emphasize two important attributes. First, its secular character, and as part of the important objective of the bill, one of the important objectives is to understand Buddha's teaching in a contemporary context without excluding any other thought and practices from any other part of the world. This, sir, was an important objective of the old Nalanda University. This remains an important objective of the new Nalanda University. And indeed, in one of the schools of the Nalanda University, the Buddhist studies and philosophy and comparative religions seeks to bring about and strike this kind of a commonality. I will not, sir, go into the funding of it. I am conscious of the constraints of time, but I cannot end my short intervention today except to quote somewhat, with your permission, sir, one little passage from the book of Amartya Sen, the mentor of this group, who talks about India and China in the context of Nalanda. And I seek your permission to quote that when Huan Sang, who has been referred to by the previous speakers, was just leaving Nalanda at that time, where he lived for 16 years, he was being implored by the monks of Nalanda to stay back. This is what Huan Sang had to reply. When he was asked that why was he leaving, because he replied in a rhetorical way that Buddha established his doctrine so that it might be diffused to all lands. And then he asked the monks, who would wish to enjoy it alone and to forget those who are not yet enlightened? And I think that with these words, Huan Sang took leave of the monks of Nalanda and then left. Let me end in an optimistic note, sir, to say that let us hope and pray that the new Nalanda University would be this voice of an enlightened Asia. Thank you, sir.
Thank you.